He found her boot half buried beneath the black moss, a bright orange hiking boot with a name scrawled across the tongue, Live, and the laces knotted as if someone had tried to bind time itself. Elias Marin tasted iron and snow in his mouth, and for a single terrible second believed the whole mountain had opened and swallowed his sister alive. The boot was too small for the tracks that led away, great depressions in the soft earth, five-toed and impossibly wide, pressing toward the dark where trees met stone. He pressed his palm to the sole until his fingertips went numb, and thought, with the sharp, animal logic of grief, that if he could prove who or what had made those tracks, he could pull her name out of the silence that had taken her. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The air smelled of resin and old rain. Above him, the mountain's jagged teeth swallowed sunlight in slow, hungry gulps. Elias had not intended to find anything that morning. He had intended only to follow the map she left, a scrap of paper with an arrow and a smudge of blood that had been folded and folded until it was both fragile and furious. He had left a life built on footnotes and refuted hypotheses, traded lectures for long boots because the corridors of academia had echoed too often with the phrase circumstantial, and because a brother will walk any distance to close a silence. Now, with the boot in his lap and the map burned into his memory, he felt a hunger he could not name. Proof that Liv had found something true, or proof that the mountain had taken her for something other than herself. The ranger found him before the snow did. She appeared at the edge of the clearing like a shadow that had learned to stand in sunlight, tall enough to be striking, with hair the color of wet bark braided against her neck, and eyes that held the weather of the region, gray, tough, and precise. Her uniform was patched in places from years of use. Her hands were quick and sure as she took the boot from Elias without asking. "You don't belong up here," she said, but her voice wasn't harsh. It was a fact, a ridgeline, a rule, a wound. "I belong where answers hide," Elias said. He didn't tell her how he had left a tenure track once, how the academic letters smelled like dust and regret. He let his insistence be the only biography he offered. The woman, Mara, she would tell him later, tilted the boot, read the name, and let out a breath that held both pity and a sharp ancestral displeasure. "Live," she repeated, as if tasting the syllable would summon the history bound to it. "You followed the map." He had expected her to be hostile. The mountain kept its own court. Instead, she regarded him as one might regard a crashed animal, curious, afraid, and a little wounded. "You can't just come to our ridge," she said. "People come here looking for ghosts and leave the place hungry." "She's my sister," Elias said. "She left this map. She followed some myth. I need to know." The syllables were brittle. He wanted to say more. "I need to know she wasn't erased, that she didn't fall into a story." But Mara watched him with a soldier's caution, and in her eyes he read an order older than the ranger station. Keep the woods between the living and whatever else lived in them. They walked in a silence that swallowed language. The trail narrowed to a goat path, then to a seam between mountainside and cliff. The trees tightened their ranks, branches knitting into a cathedral. Every now and then, Mara would sing under her breath, a line that was not a song as much as an old name, and the forest would answer with a distant crack or the hush of falling water. Elias felt watched, not by human eyes, but by the mountain itself. He was at once relieved and furious, relieved because someone else knew the terrain, furious because he had followed the map here for months and now had to share the claim. Mara spoke little of Anak then. The Sasquatch, Omul Paduri to the locals, Anak to some willing to whisper a name, was more myth than marker in Elias' world. He had studied Bigfoot in journals and grainy footage, had even lectured on cultural contagions, but none of those theories could prepare him for the first time the ground seemed to inhale in his presence, and an odor like peat and old smoke filled his nose. They crested a ridge, and there, in a clearing high enough the sky felt thin, something enormous sat like a ruined tower half risen from the earth. The creature was wrapped in fur the color of bedrock, shoulders hunched in a posture that was not feral but anciently regal. Its eyes were deep-set, luminous, with a slow patience that made Elias' pulse sound like a child's in a hollow throat. Anech watched them, and neither moved nor stirred. Mara stopped a few paces away, hands folded in a gesture both deferent and defensive. "We don't go near the ruins," she said, though she had led him to the place as surely as if she had been pulling him by a thread. "We keep the old things buried. The pact is old. It kept us safe." Elias' rational mind clicked in spite of the tremor in his gut. "Pact?" She sighed, and the exhale seemed to carry the lineage of 100 small fears. "Centuries. My family, our families, made a trade with whatever lives up here. We bury the stone, we bleed for the promise, and in return, the mountains turn away from our villages. We feed them warnings, sometimes offerings. We don't take what they guard." Her mouth tightened. "You come from the city. You will not understand the price." "I understand loss," Elias said. "I understand bargains made in desperation." "My sister." He stopped because speaking Liv's name felt like breaking a covenant. He pressed the boot into his pack as if the thing itself could cease to be an accusation. "She disappeared after she found traces near here. I found this. I have a right." "You have no right to disturb the ruins," Mara said. Her voice was suddenly steel. "Not for answers, not for glory, not for proof." The Sasquatch blinked. The blink was a motion of such slow deliberation that Elias felt it to the marrow. Then something shifted. Not sound, not in the way humans make language, but in a pressure against his skull, like a pebble rolling against a buried tooth. A vision or a memory. A coastline under a different sun. Stone arches half swallowed by salt. Metalwork not of any culture he could name, curling like the ribs of a sleeping beast. The feeling left him breathless and absurdly old. Mara did not flinch. She watched Anik with a reverence that made Elias angrier. "You feel it too," she said finally. "The ones who guard the ruins don't speak like us. They give glimpses, but glimpses are dangerous. You saw a piece, and already you hunger for the rest. That's how it begins." He had not known how hungry he would be until that hunger was named. Liv had been brave in ways Elias had only admired from the safer distance of theory. She had chased myths with the ferocity of someone trying to catch back a life. When she vanished, she left him the map and a chorus of half-sentences. Now, with Onyx's presence like a pulse in the earth, those fragments became a direction, a promise, a knife. He wanted to pry the mountain open and drag its truth into light. He imagined the journal articles, the vindication, the closure of a grief that had become a dull, constant ache. Mara's watchfulness softened and then stiffened like someone folding a coat with hands that had never learned gentleness. "If you love her," she said finally, "then you must love her enough to let some things be." The sentence fell like a blade he could not catch. "You must not make the mountain an object for your sorrow." He laughed briefly and without humor. "Let her remain a ghost so I can sleep? How is that loving? How is silence a kindness?" Her jaw tightened. "Because some truths unmake more than secrets." She met his eyes then, not with the formal detachment of a ranger, but with something like pity that hurt. And for the first time he saw the weight she carried. In the hollows behind her eyes were mapped the names of children who had fallen from cliffs, a villager swallowed by blizzards. In that list was the ancient shame her family kept hidden, a pact that had demanded blood in exchange for protection. The memory of those bargains sat between them like a third body, heavy and needing air. They did not argue long. The mountain's moods are not patient with human debates. Wolves howled in the distance, and the weather closed in, pushing snow sideways like thrown flour. Mara offered Elias a shelter at the ranger post, a small building smelling of coffee and wood smoke. And Elias accepted because walking back into the wild that night felt like asking the night to swallow him whole. Inside the station, by a small stove that hummed against the cold, they exchanged fragments: a scrap of Liv's handwriting, a photograph of her laughing on a lower ridge, a map with an arrow in the corner. When he told Mara about the messages he'd found on Liv's phone, jumbled notes about salt and stone, ships under flags that weren't ours, the word Atlantean scrawled and crossed out, her face did not go pale. It went hard. Atlantean is a word for people who love treasure, she said, for those who would take and trade and not pay attention to what they break. There was an accusation in the sentence that had nothing to do with his sister and everything to do with the city that trained him to turn nature into data. He felt a hot flare of defensiveness. I'm not looking for treasure. I'm looking for Liv. And you'll find her by tearing what keeps her safe, Mara replied. You think proof will bring her back. Proof will bring others. Corporations, scientists, men who will dig and not care what wakes. Her fingers curled on the cup she held. We keep a balance here. My family has kept it. It's not always noble. It is not always just. But it has kept people alive. Elias wanted to shout that truth, science, had saved lives too, that knowledge was not an enemy. But a human life sat between them, and he had no clean argument to offer for the years Liv had been missing. He owned a map and a boot and a stubbornness that felt more like hunger than love. Mara owned a law older than the registrar's office, and a vow spoken in the dark with hands that had learned to bury. Between their wants, the mountain hummed like a lung. That night, when the storm drove itself into the ridges and the ranger station creaked like an old ship, Elias lay awake and listened to the mountain breathe. He had wanted certainty, proof that Liv had not been erased, evidence that would wash away the accusing quiet of the world. Instead, he lay with a new, sharper complication. Proof would not only reveal, it would displace, it would wound. It could open something that had been sewn shut for centuries. In the morning, he would face a neck again, and the creature's slow eyes would be a mirror that showed him more than he had asked to see. And Mara's nearness was an irritation and a balm. Her rules were a chain he wanted to break, and a mercy he was already beginning to understand. Outside, somewhere under the snow, the mountain kept its ancient, patient watch. Inside, Elias stared at the photograph of his sister and felt the distance between proof and love narrow into a single, impossible line. He was a man who wanted to reclaim a past written in footprints, and the mountain was a living thing with a memory older than his need. The first act of their collision had begun, and with it the rules would shift, names would be bartered, and a heart that had been reduced to a quest would meet a law that demanded sacrifice. The next morning came with a brittle clarity that felt like accusation. Snow crusted the windows of the ranger post in delicate lace. Thin shafts of light cut through and painted Elias' face in lines. Mara was already awake, moving with the deliberate, minimal gestures of someone who had learned to conserve heat and worry in equal measure. Outside, the world was white and mute. Inside, their conversation resumed where it had left off the night before, only sharper, as though the cold had stripped away diplomatic clothes. "You need to understand one thing about this mountain," Mara said, tying her hair back with a motion that was both functional and an old nervous habit. "A neck does not keep secrets to make us suffer. He keeps them because some truths are active. They reach outward. They think. They remember. You say Atlantean like it's a relic, but from up here, with the visions he gives," she hesitated, the word a small agitation in her mouth. "They look less like dead cities and more like systems, like engines, things that were designed to do work across time." Elias listened. He was, by temperament, a man who loved classifications, taxonomy of the unknown, categories that made the wild sensible. Mara's sentence pushed at those categories until the edges frayed. Engines? How? She pulled a chair closer to the stove and folded her hands as if to warm them against a fate. "The songs my grandmother used to sing, hers from my grandmother, spoke of ribs of metal under stone, of lights like moons that moved beneath the sea. We were told then to sing the mountain to sleep, to teach the woods a pattern of forgetting. The pact wasn't just a bargain, it was a maintenance, a promise to hold down what used to be awake." "It sounds like myth language for infrastructure," Elias said. He did not intend the phrase to sound flippant, but it came out clipped, hungry for conceptual purchase. A machine under the earth could be dangerous. So could it be beneficial, if Liv found something. "If she wake it," Mara said flatly, and the word cut the room like glass. "If she willed it, and you will it with her data and your proofs, you will not make it better. You will make it active." "Elias," she said softly, "you're carrying a map and a boot and a lit fuse. That is not the same as a rescue." He had expected reprimand. He had not expected care folded into it. Her hands, calloused and small, reached for a pot of coffee as though that ordinary human motion would anchor them both. Elias's pulse thudded with the old, achy map of grief. He had trained himself to move in straight lines towards answers, but here he felt guilt like a tidal pull. He wanted to be the sensible sibling, the rational connector of dots, but sensibility never reached for the missing. Sensibility never burned like the need to pull an absence into presence. "You said Anak gives glimpses," Elias said, forcing his voice steady. Did you? Have you asked him about Liv? Do the glimpses show people? Can he tell me if she is—" Mara's face folded into something like sorrow. "Anak shows us shapes, not people. The mountain remembers patterns, coastlines, architectures, events, but not the smallness of an individual life unless that life touched something vast. Even then, it is a riddle wrapped in a tide." Her fingers tightened on the cup until knuckles blanched. "And the glimpses are not neutral. They demand payment. They ask for focus. They ask for attention. They sow hunger." Elias heard the word sow, and he saw in his mind's eye his sister, Liv, kneeling on a slope, staring at a carved stone, her breath white, the map curled in her gloved hand. He saw a light in her eyes that had been mistaken for madness by polite colleagues and misread as stubbornness by those who feared myth. That light had been worth the risk to her. To him, it was a summons. "She's my sister," he said, the sentence both shield and plea. "If there is a chance—" "There are always chances," Mara interrupted, and her voice hardened in the way of a woman who had had to say no to enough to keep bodies whole. "There are choices, Elias, choices that save a single person and choices that stop a whole valley from starving." Her refusal pressed against something in him, shame at his own audacity, fury at being told to contain his grief for the safety of nameless others. He wanted to be righteous. He also wanted to be alone with his need. The two impulses made him clumsy and angry. He left the stove with more force than he intended and flung a flannel coat over his shoulders. Outside, the mountain was patient and indifferent. The trees sat like sentries with their arms folded. They walked back toward the clearing where Anak sat, the creature a dark, moving hill. This time, Mara brought an offering, a wrapped cloth, something that smelled of juniper and old iron. She knelt at the edge of Anak's domain and struck the stone twice in a slow rhythm. The sound was low and ceremonial. The Sasquatch's head lifted, and for a moment the world contracted to the space between that head and Mara's bowed form. Elias felt a pressure behind his eyes, the same pebble rolling against a tooth. A vision unspooled, a harbor at midnight, columns of men with curved swords, a language of banners that did not belong to any atlas he knew. Then a crack, a sound like a bell underwater. Ships listed as if the sea itself had teeth. Stone rose and fell. The image blew away like spent fog. Elias stumbled, clinging to a tree. Anak's presence was no longer merely historic, it was chronological, keyed to a timeline Elias could feel in his ribs. The creature's long life had catalogued catastrophes and calibrations. When Mara whispered to him, she never spoke aloud the words Anak answered to. Elias understood that the Sasquatch's memory had rules. It would share, but in fragments, and only as much as it wished. "Why hide?" Elias asked, his voice small. The reasoning he'd rehearsed for months reduced to the size of a child's. If what is buried could change everything, help people, save them from storms, from hunger? If these are engines, you say, couldn't they be used for good? Mara's laugh was a brittle thing. "Who decides good?" she said. "Who sits with a machine and judges use? The city? A corporation with a board that pays people to forget ethics in exchange for profit? The machines in the wrong hands don't sing. They become maps to the kinds of destruction that changed whole climates. We traded one set of ruin for a larger amnesia. That is the pact." Her words struck like flint. Elias's mind supplied counterexamples: hydroelectric power, medical breakthroughs, satellites that tracked storms. But the mountain's own counterargument threaded through his chest. What if human hunger could never be regulated? What if knowledge without humility was an accelerant? They returned eventually to the station, where Mara took a battered tin box from a shelf and opened it with fingers that had memorized its hinge. Inside were photographs, yellowed and creased, faces, children, ceremonies, snapshots of a vigilance that had felt to Elias like superstition. But in the back of the box lay something else, a ledger, small and dense, written in an old hand. Mara flipped it open. Lines of names had been inked in a steady script, births, offerings, censures, and then, in a hand that was less formal and more trembling, a single entry that made Elias's chest convulse. An ancestor's name followed by the words sealed, blood, promise. "Your family signed with us," Elias said, the syllables heavy. He had not expected the ledger to make his world tilt, but it did. The mountain's pacts were not mythic abstractions. They had signatures, and those signatures were familial chains. Mara swallowed. "My great-grandmother was there when the stones were bound. She told the story once. We didn't know what else to do. There were floods, and we thought the mountain's mercy had been purchased. There are things about my blood that are not clean." Everything in Elias wanted to turn the ledger into a thesis, a neat arc that he could annotate, footnote, theorize away. But the words blood and promise had edges that refused to be academic. They were literal and tactile. There was, implicit in the script, a cost. As if summoned by the knowledge of other hands wanting the same ledger, the wind shifted. A far voice, muffled by snow, reached them. At first like a gull, then human and crisp. Someone else was on the ridge. Mara's face tightened into that keener instrument she reserved for danger. She rose, took a hunting rifle from the peg behind the door, more as threat than for hunting, and peered through the window. Down the slope, a line of tracks marred the virgin snow, crisp and deliberate. The prints were not local. Boot treads stamped with synthetic precision, the geometry of tire-chained machines, the smell of diesel carried in a breath of wind. And with those tracks came the shape of intent, more than curiosity, a search funded by interest. Elias's body went cold with a new, modern fear. He had left the sterile corridors of academia to escape polite exploitation of rareness, but men with funding and equipment moved differently. They arrived with instruments, charters, lawyers. Mara's jaw clenched. They came down from the valley, she said. Corporate surveyors, or worse. They buy rights to what they can map. You mean they'll dig? Elias asked, the syllables snapping. Mara's answer was a look. They will map, record, monetize. They will bulldoze without asking the mountain if it wishes to be rearranged. For the first time since he had found the boot and lived inside Liv's absence, Elias saw an enemy that was not just grief or secrecy, but a fluency in acquisition. He had fantasized about proving the existence of the Sasquatch and the ruin in order to vindicate Liv. He had not allowed himself to imagine the cost, that vindication might bring people who would harvest the mountain's bones for trophies and patents. "Let them come," he said abruptly, the words a mix of defiance and a flaring, childish hope. "If they dig and find her, if they find evidence." Mara's hand came down on his shoulder, firm as a brake. "You still say 'if,' as if the mountain is a museum. There are living things here. Ansorek holds a mind older than both of us. If they wake the wrong thing, 'if' becomes 'when.'" Her certainty steadied him and scared him simultaneously. He could imagine the headlines. Elias Marin vindicated, cryptid proves sister's fate. Images of trophies and corporate logos and scientists in spotless gloves. He could also imagine the opposite. Liv's remains, cataloged and displayed, a closure that felt like theft. The tracks in the snow stitched upward like an accusation. In the distance, beyond flat white, metallic shapes glinted. Men with scopes, a satellite antenna clipped to a truck, the strange modern talismans of those who believed everything could be owned. They moved with authorized confidence. Maps in hand, they believed property was a simple thing. Mara rose, hard as winter glass. "We can't let them reach the ruins," she said. Her voice carried, public, commanding. "If they get to Ansorek, they get to the engines. If they get to the engines—" "They won't put them to use responsibly," Elias finished. The truth felt both savage and necessary. It knotted his throat. He had come to the mountain for a sister and found himself the unlikely guardian of a silence he had been taught his whole academic life to refuse.
"Will you stay?" Mara asked. And the question was no longer merely about an overnight shelter or a reluctant alliance. It carried the weight of a choice, to cross from seeking into stewardship, to allow his quest to become a campaign to protect what he wanted to expose. Elias's answer trembled with confession and something like a dawning reduction of appetite. "I came for proof," he said honestly, "but I did not think about what proof would feed, not until now." Mara's eyes softened for a second, betrayed by something like relief. "Then choose," she said. "Choose whether you will be a hammer seeking a nail or a hand learning to seal a wound." They drew a map together on the back of an old envelope, marking the approach routes and the line of the intruders, the places where the mountain's voice had thinned and where Anak's gaze might be deflected. They argued heatedly, and then with pages of compromise. Elias felt currents inside him he had never navigated, love and hunger not yet sorted, duty and desire only just recognizing each other across a table. Each plan cast them nearer together. Each strategy required proximity and trust. When they finished, the sun had slid down, and the men at the clearing had made camp, mechanized lamps flaring like eyes. The mountain's silence thickened into an expectation. Onyx watched them all without movement, a presence like a promise that could be kept or broken. In the dim, Elias found himself standing near Mara, their shoulders brushing. The contact sparked an electrical, intimate heat that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with proximity and shared risk. "Don't let them reach the ruins," Mara murmured, more to herself than to him, but her breath ghosted his cheek. "If they wake more than what's buried, we lose more than a story." Elias nodded. He had come to the mountain with a map and a boot. Now he left the station with a new map inked in his mind, one that charted not only evidence but promises and possible betrayals. He thought of Liv, of the fierce intelligence that had sent her climbing, of the map with its blood smudge that had been both marker and plea. If he loved his sister, he had to decide whether to expose her footsteps to the light or to bury them under a stewardship he had not asked for. As night fell and machines hummed at the tree line, their plans small and human and fragile, Elias and Mara understood that the mountain would not be moved by desire alone. It was entropy and history and a creature who remembered empires. The choice ahead was not merely tactical, but ethical, to pull the past into the present and risk a future none of them could predict, or to fold back the secret and live with a grief that would never wear the neat shape of proof. The intruders' fires glowed like low moons on the slope, and beyond them the ocean, far imagined, rolled in Elias' chest like a memory. He slept poorly that night, pulled between the urgency of a missing sister and the widening sense that some things, once named, never again agreed to be small. When he closed his eyes, he saw the harbor, the flags, the ships going down into a sea that remembered wrongdoings. And over that, like a slow breath, a neck's patient face, waiting for them to choose. The first shot was not a gunshot. It was a camera's shutter, bright and obscene against the snow. It flared from the intruder's camp like a brittle star, and the men who held the lenses laughed with the casual cruelty of people who think discovery is entitlement. They mapped angles and logged coordinates and treated the slope as if it were land already deeded to them in the columns of their notebooks. A truck revved, chains scraped. The mechanized lights churned the forest into a carnival of false clarity. Elias thought, absurdly, of classrooms. The soft applause after a well-received paper, the polite questions that hid the hunger for ownership. He had imagined triumphant vindication as something noble, a clearing in which Liv's name rose like a clean bell. He had not expected the way the world outside would smell, of diesel and grilling meat and newsprint. He had not expected how suddenly dirty vindication could feel. Mara moved with all the quick quiet of someone whose life was a series of anticipations. She had already roused a handful of villagers, older men with eyes that had seen the mountains take their due, and younger ones who still swung an axe with righteous fury. They padded out in small groups, ghosts in camo and wool, to mark the lines where the intruders should not pass. Somewhere inside Elias, gratitude and shame braided into a single hot thing. He knew he ought to be grateful she defended the ground he wanted to expose. He also wanted to scream that he had a right to know, to display, to prove. The first fracture came not from the intruders, but from a familiar voice, warm and low, and crowned with the kind of intimacy that bends a man mid-stride. Mara. It was her cousin, Ion, who had the look of someone who inherited both a family's stubborn jaw and its talent for compromise.
He emerged from behind a fir, breathing steam. His cheeks were raw with cold, his hands scrubbed in a way that suggested hands that had known money. He carried a tablet. "We shouldn't fight them directly," he said. "We should talk. We can get a share for the village. We can sell rights, regulate access." Mara's posture sealed into granite. "You would sell us out." Ion said, his voice practical, like someone who sees suffering as a ledger entry. "You don't understand, Mara. Grants, research funds, they mean clinics, school roofs. You hold a ledger of guilt. I hold a ledger of roofs." Elias watched them and felt himself dragged into a familial arithmetic he did not belong to, watching loyalties count like coins. Mara's face slackened with something like grief and anger that was too old for him to soothe. "You signed," she said. The accusation was not merely about money. It was a wound opened by history. "I didn't sign what you think," Eon said. He looked at Elias briefly, as if weighing the man's usefulness. "We can keep Onyx safe and make the mountain better for people. Think bigger than ghosts and oaths." "Better for people," Mara repeated, as if the sentence stuck in her mouth like a stone. "You mean the will of men who never had to bury the dead?" The villagers shifted. The white world seemed to hold its breath. That night, when they crept closer to the clearing to see how the intruders had positioned cameras and scrape marks, Elias heard the soft clink of metal on metal where a shovel bit a stone. He stepped forward, heart a fist around the boot in his pack, and saw a man in the intrusive camp plant a flag. No longer a flag of nation, but a logo. A pale, corporate sigil that glittered like a promise to markets and patents. Someone laughed. Someone uncapped a bottle. Elias moved because his feet had learned movement in straight lines, towards evidence, towards truth. He forgot the pact Mara had borrowed from memory, and the way Onyx Visions had been careful with little lives. He told himself the best option was to watch, to record, to document, and then to bring the record to those who could rescue Liv. His hands shook when he lifted a borrowed spotting scope and focused. What he saw in the illuminated mouth of a camera startled him into a fierce animal clarity. A man in a cap bent near a depression and touched the side of something protruding from the earth. A seam of metal, blackened by time, but etched with a geometry that made Elias' breath stop. The man did not dig with reverence. He brushed grit away as you might dust an artifact for a museum display. He smiled and swore softly into a microphone. It was one thing to theorize about engines. It was another to see a hand treat them like a toy. The rusted edge gleamed, and for a heartbeat, Elias imagined the machines all over again. Not sentient engines of a lost civilization, but bank accounts and patents. The mountain might be harvested, and Liv's absence would become a line item in someone else's balance sheet. He moved forward. He stepped on a trail of soft snow, and his foot made a sound like a cry. A bright spotlight swiveled. A dog barked. Men shouted. The camp erupted like an injured animal. He was visible. Mara was there within seconds, gasoline cold and furious. She grabbed his arm and pulled him back into shadow with an expert motion that spoke of 1,000 practiced urgencies. Her face was a mask of ice and blood. "Don't," she hissed into his ear. "If they find out you were here, they will use you. They will use anything to get to the stones." "Don't tell me what to do," Elias said, the words out before he could smooth them into something more reasonable. Fear and something like betrayal braided into his voice. "I could have kept quiet, collected evidence, brought help that would find Liv. We could have worked together." "You wanted to work alone," she snapped. "You came with a map and a tooth for proof. You walked in like a man who thinks the world is his beta field." His mouth opened to retort and closed when a figure emerged from the tree line. Ion. And behind him, something he had thought dead, a set of papers, contracts with signatures and stamps, and a clause that specified the mountain as a site of commercial potential. Ion held them as if the paper itself were a sleeping child. "You promised nothing," Mara said to him, eyes blazing. "You promised you wouldn't sign." Ion's jaw flicked. "I promised villages' roofs. I promised futures. You promised secrecy, and you keep asking us to starve on your promises of tradition. Who feeds our children?" "You don't bargain with living things as if they were coin," Mara spat, "not with my family's name on the line." Elias felt the scale tilt. He understood, dimly and with the painful slowness of someone learning a new grammar, that there were collateral costs to everything he wanted. Ion thought of roofs, Mara thought of pacts, Elias thought of a sister's boot and a map. The three of them stood in a triangle, each point sharp and unyielding. "Maybe she wouldn't have wanted to be found this way," Mara said finally, though it was more to herself than to him. "Maybe she went where the mountain asked her to. We don't own her search." Elias recoiled as if the sentence had struck. He had given Liv the right to chase myth. He had given himself the right to rescue her from consequence. That night, as the sounds of chains and engines filled the air, and the men renewed their mapping like a hymn to ownership, a wedge drove into his chest. The suspicion that his sister had not simply vanished, but had chosen the ruin as a kind of altar. The second fracture was quieter, but more devastating. Arca, after the skirmish at the tree line, after Ion argued and the men in the camp fortified their lighting with a shrug, Elias retreated into the ranger station to gather his pack. He needed the boot. He needed something he could carry that felt like a promise to himself. Mara had stepped outside to speak with the villagers, and the station smelt faintly of coffee gone to coldness. He looked for Liv's map. He had left it on the table earlier, close to the coffee can. It was not there. Panic clawed instantly at his throat. He rifled through drawers with a clumsy need that was more prayer than method. There, at the bottom of a file folder, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth, was a note he had not seen before, the ink smudged from snow. "Liv, if found, don't dig the engines. Don't let them wake. Trust a netch. Find the song." Elias stared, and the letters rearranged his guts. His sister, who had chased myths like a woman chasing air, had written caution. She had written restraint.
The adrenaline of rescue curdled into a terrible, shimmering clarity. Liv might have understood some of what the mountain was, and she had left instructions to keep it still. If that was true, then every scheme he had entertained to drag the ruin into daylight was a betrayal of her last known will. He felt as if someone else had been turned inside out. For a long minute he stood in the dim and the cold, the station a small boat on an indifferent sea. His hunger to find and to prove became something fouler. The risk that he would reduce his sister to an exhibit. The truth scraped along bone. When Mara returned, she found him with the paper in his hand and the color drained from his face. Her eyes softened for a second, then hardened with the reflex of a woman who has to hold an order against her longing. "She wrote that?" she asked. "She wrote—" His voice broke as if something in him had been cut. "She told me not to wake them." Mara swallowed, and when she spoke again, the words were small and nearly sacred. "Then listen to her." Elias wanted to tell her that he had a right to find the truth of her disappearance, that proof would make the silence manageable. Instead, he heard himself say, in a voice he did not recognize, "I was willing to tear it open." Mara flinched as if struck. "You were willing?" It was not an accusation of intention so much as an unmasking of hunger. In her face, he saw the reflection of a man he had been, ruthless, single-minded, convinced that outcomes could be engineered. The mountain and Onich had peeled him back to a new shape. He felt exposed and ashamed and, for the first time, uncertain in a way that burned. They argued, not about strategy, but about fidelity, to live, to the mountain, to the histories that were not theirs to dissolve. He accused her of refusing to help him because her duty trumped compassion. She accused him of weaponizing his sister's memory for proof. Voices rose and fell like small avalanches. The ledger of old bargains sat heavy between them. When the shouting ebbed, Mara gathered her coat with hands that trembled in a way Elias had never seen. "I can't trust you," she said, and it was not a sentence she threw lightly. "Not tonight." "I came for Liv," he said, which felt suddenly insufficient and self-important. "Then honor her boundaries," she replied. "Go home and write your papers about grief. Leave this mountain alone." He thought she would stay. He thought the closeness of nights and plans had welded them. Then she turned and left the station without another word. Her back receded into the snow and the light of the camp beyond it. And when she looked over her shoulder, there was no pleading in her eyes, only something like sorrow and duty colliding. Elias sat with the note in his hand and felt the fissure widen. He had come to the mountain to find proof and instead had been offered a different ledger, one inked in blood and song and an old, trembling promise. He had wanted to be the hero who brings light. Instead, he had become a silhouette of the very hunger he had fought so long to deny. Outside, the intruders tightened their configuration, and later, a shout, angrier, more decisive, rose as if someone had decided the night would no longer hide them. From the clearing, Anek watched with the slow, tragic patience of a creature who had seen men make the same mistakes again and again. He lifted his enormous head, and for the first time, Elias thought he saw in those vast black eyes not only memory, but disappointment, as one might feel for a child who had ignored a warning. Elias realized, with a clarity that felt like a small death and a small birth in the same breath, that there were loyalties deeper than his need. He had thought of himself as a rescuer. Now he understood he had been reckless. And somewhere under that understanding, a tenderness for Mara, raw, unclaimed, stirred and reared its head. He wanted to call her back. He wanted to kneel and beg forgiveness. He wanted to swear fealty to a pact he had only just understood. But apologies are often the balm of those who have been forgiven. Mara's departure was a wound that would not heal with words alone. The fractures had been made, between them, between the village and Ion, between those who would monetize and those who would guard. The mountain hummed as if waiting for the next choice to be made, and in Elias's hands, the note from Liv cooled like a coin you cannot spend. He was alone in a station that smelled of tar and coffee and songs he had never learned. Outside, beyond the thin walls, the snow shuddered with the stamping of men who had the smell of commerce in their lungs. Above all, in the dark and slow watch of Anek, something like a verdict settled. The mountain would not yield without cost, and those who came to take without listening would have to reckon with a history that had teeth. Elias pressed the note to his forehead until the paper warmed with his skin, and, for the first time since he had found the boot, let himself cry, not for the proof he had chased, but for the sister who had known the danger and had still chosen to go, for the woman who had guarded a secret with the hard kindness of a sentinel, and for his own hands that had nearly moved like thieves. The fractures were not yet healed. They would fester, or they would force growth. Either way, the mountain had taught him the cost of hunger. And somewhere in the hush that followed, beneath the metallic stars and the low, patient sound Anek made, as if counting time in his sleep, Elias heard the ocean of memory roll, and knew the choices ahead would demand more than courage. They would demand reverence. He heard her before he saw her. Footfall in the thin snow. The hush of someone who had spent a life moving through trees so they made no complaint.
Mara's outline cut against the dark like a healed scar. She paused on the threshold of the clearing, shoulders squared as if she had been turned inside out and pressed flat with decision. Behind her, a handful of villagers fanned out, faces set like flint. Between them and the intruders, the night smelled of diesel and something older, a promise about to be broken. "Mara," Elias began, voice raw and small in the open air. She didn't answer at once. Instead, she walked to where Anik sat, and for the first time since she'd left the station, she did something outwardly impossible. She placed her palm against the Sasquatch's fur, up near a shoulder that could have been a cliff. Anik's great head bent, the motion a consent aged to bone. The snow flurried like a hush. Elias watched them and felt a new fierce tenderness, hers for the mountain, hers perhaps in a smaller private way for him, that braided his chest tight. "I can't let them dig," she said, almost to the creature, almost to the night. When she turned to him, her face was bare of the ranger's armor he'd known. "But I can't do it alone." "You said not to wake them," Elias said. The sentence was a stone tossed in steadier water. "Liv wrote that. I nearly let them. You nearly did what many nearly do," Mara interrupted gently. "But nearly is not a refuge." She stepped closer, closer than she'd ever let anyone stand. "Why did you come, Elias? For proof or for her?" He swallowed. In the hush, the answer surprised him with its honesty. "Both," he admitted. "But I would rather lose my life's work than lose the truth of what she wanted us to keep." She studied him as if unwrapping a small, complicated object. Words mean little. Action means more. Her fingers brushed his sleeve in a touch that was not accidental and not indulgent, simply necessary. "Then act with me. Not for the papers, for Liv." They moved together like that, two uneven instruments learning to play a single improvised score. He carried the boot in his pack as if it were a reliquary. She carried an old song on her lips. The villagers formed a crude line between camp and ruin. Ion argued and flapped and tried to negotiate with men who had already decided negotiation was an obstacle. But Mara's presence made the perimeter feel like a vow. Elias handed out ropes he'd scrounged from the station. He relayed plans with a voice steadier than he felt. They were not soldiers, merely people who loved different things into a common purpose. The intruders pushed. A light swept the trees, a drone hummed like an impatient insect, and someone in the camp fired a flare to blind the view. Then the mountain answered, not with Anik's sudden violence, but with a loom of warning, a low sound like a tree groaning at its roots, a line of snow slumping as if the earth itself took a breath. The men faltered. Cameras clicked. For all their modern certainties, they were animals before a storm. It was then that Ion made his choice. He stepped between Mara and one of the surveyors, tablet in hand, and offered something small and human. His village's refusal to sell, signed and public, with his own name to the ink. The man with the cap spat and shoved him. The shove would have been one more escalation if not for Mara's cry, a sound not of anger, but of something binding and fierce, and Anek's slow, enormous stride. Anek did not attack. He rose and planted a paw, and under that paw the very seams of the earth seemed to realign. The sound was like a great bell heard from underwater. The intruder's dogs whimpered, chains slackened. A last, clumsy shovel strike hit metal, and the metal answered with a cry that was biological rather than industrial, a vibration that went through bone. Men clutched their ears. Some fled. One pushed forward, drawn by greed or stubbornness, and a rope tightened around his wrist as if the mountain had taken hold. He was not hurt, only halted, his face paling with something ancestral that had nothing to do with law. In the lull, Mara turned to Elias. Snowflakes dusted her lashes like small white flags. "We have a small window," she said. "Anak gives it to us because we asked with the right hunger. We will rebury what they exposed. We will seal the seam again." Elias felt something in him unravel and reknit all at once. He could think of a dozen reasons to refuse: career, vindication, the neatness of answers. But standing in front of Mara, under the patient, ancient gaze of Anak, he heard Liv's handwriting in his head. "Don't wake them. Trust Anak. Find the song." The command felt like an inheritance. "I will help," he said. "I will do whatever it takes to close it. Not to hide, but to honor." "That's not the same as silence," Mara said, and the sentence carried a strange blessing. It's stewardship. They worked as night peeled away the edges of the struggle. Villagers heaved stones, while Mara recited an old folding chant, syllables that fit like wedges into the seam. Elias dug with gloved hands until the cut in his palm smarted. He lowered a slab of metal that somehow fit into the place like a lid. Anak guided them, not with words, but with pressure and image, showing the pattern of placement with a patience that felt holy. Twice the intruders tried to pry. Twice the mountain made them step back. And twice Ion's signatures held men at bay who had meant to buy futures on someone else's ruin. When the last slab was set, Mara asked for blood. An old wound, ceremonial, not to wound the living, but to complete a promise. Her request nailed something solid in Elias' chest, the price of trust. Without thinking, he offered his cut hand. He let a drop warm the stone where the metal met earth, and Mara, without ceremony and with a reverence that made him dizzy, did the same. The gesture was not a binding like a contract, but a mutual witnessing. They worked as night peeled away the edges of the struggle. Villagers heaved stones, while Mara recited an old folding chant, syllables that fit like wedges into the seam. Elias dug with gloved hands until the cut in his palm smarted. He lowered a slab of metal that somehow fit into the place like a lid. Anak guided them, not with words, but with pressure and image, showing the pattern of placement with a patience that felt holy. Twice the intruders tried to pry. Twice the mountain made them step back. And twice Ion's signatures held men at bay who had meant to buy futures on someone else's ruin. When the last slab was set, Mara asked for blood. An old wound, ceremonial, not to wound the living, but to complete a promise. Her request nailed something solid in Elias' chest, the price of trust. Without thinking, he offered his cut hand. He let a drop warm the stone where the metal met earth, and Mara, without ceremony and with a reverence that made him dizzy, did the same. The gesture was not a binding like a contract, but a mutual witnessing. Liv's warning had been obeyed by one sibling. Now, in the hard, cold dark, under the vigil of a creature older than their names, another sibling completed the vow. They sealed the seam. The earth settled. Anak sank back low, a hill resuming its posture. Light dimmed in the camp, as if a plug had been pulled. Men cursed, and then, with less bravado, packed away their machines. Ion walked toward Mara and Elias with a stooped humility and offered the villagers a promise that was not commerce, but care. A fund for roofs raised by the community, not a sale of the mountain. It was imperfect. It was human. In the bleeding blue of pre-dawn, tired and shivering, Mara leaned in to Elias. Her forehead met his, and for a breath that trembled between need and fatigue, they simply held each other. Words were small. The world had been vast that night and asked more of them than either had expected to give. "You could go back," she whispered. "You could take your papers and your charts and make a case for the world to learn in the right way." He laughed, a sound that broke and reformed. "I don't know the right way anymore," he said,
but I know which way is mine. Stay, she said, not because I asked, but because I would like you near when the mountain remembers. He pressed his lips to her temple, clumsy and sincere. If staying means stewardship, then yes. He thought of Liv and of the boot in his pack and felt a peace like the settling of a tide. He had not gained the clean vindication he had craved. He had gained something more, dangerous and truer. A life rearranged toward reverence, and a hand to keep while the world outside still wanted to take. Anak watched them with that same slow, ancient patience. When he rose to leave them, padding back into the forest like a dusk-made god, Elias understood that some loves are like mountains. They require patience, patient work, and sacrifices that are not always heroic to the world, but are impossible to their small people. He had given up a proof, he had claimed a responsibility. The price was not an end, but a new beginning, toughened, haunted, and bound by a secret that would shake them in ways neither had foreseen. They rebuilt the ledger together, roofs mended by village hands, Ion's promises reshaped into caretaking funds, the seam sealed and sung over until stone remembered forgetfulness. Elias stayed. Mara taught him the old names and the right silences. At dawn, they stood on the ridge, boots sunk in thawing snow, and watched Anak melt into the pines as the ocean in Elias's chest finally stilled.